most of the time you will want to copy a query and tweak it, because we have so many queries out there that you probably will find, if not the exact thing that you need, something very close. And that is a very good way to learn query, is to look at other queries that are already created. However, there are times when you will want to create a new query. So what we want to do is we're going to navigate here to Query Manager, Reporting Tools, Query Manager. This is where we also just finished looking at an existing query to review what the query tabs were and what they mean. Now we're going to actually use those query tabs to create a new query. So I'll click on the Create New Query link. And I know I'm in a new query because it says New Unsaved Query, Record Name. If I don't see these two things, then I'm probably in an existing query and forgot to click on the link. So you want to return to Query Manager in that case and start again. So record name, I can start with LE to find my ledger table, or I could key the whole word in. That would made it a little bit simpler. If I would have keyed it in, more of the word in. But I may not necessarily know what the name of the table is. So it's okay to do a very simple few letters for the table name and then do a search. The other thing that you can do is you can use advanced search to find the table if you're not sure, because the simple search gives you begin with, advanced search gives you a lot more options. And I can change this to contains and just do, I know it's got the word ledger in it somewhere, use my wildcards. We talked about wildcards a little bit already. And then it'll bring me anything with those letters in it. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily helpful either, depending on what you're looking for. But if I truly did not know the name of my table, it might be a helpful way of finding it. Contains is probably the record name option that you use the most. Need to pause myself a little bit here. Okay. So let's go back to basic search, since we're pretty certain we know what we're looking for. I'm going to find my ledger table, and it's actually the one on top. Now notice when you're looking at these tables that you have a table name, which is in all caps, and it's followed by a dash and then the description of the table. That's very important, because what you truly want is the name of the table, not to focus on the description. Because if I just focused on ledger data, there's many that have the wording ledger data in them. Even the ledger budget KK table is just described as a ledger data table. So I know I want ledger, so I'm going to click on Add Record. Now that I have my table opened up here in the Query tab, I can begin selecting my fields that I want to use in my output. When I select them here, then they will show up in the Fields tab. Notice that all these fields are key fields. In other words, for the ledger table, it's a very unusual table in that it takes most, I think probably over 10 or 15 possible combinations to make up a unique row of data. So for this particular query, I want to pick the ledger. I'm going to pick account, department ID, fund code, program code, and project. I also want the posted total amount. That's going to be useful to me. I want to know what the fiscal year is. And that gives me quite a bit of information to work from. So now that I've selected these, I can go over to my Fields tab and see what order they're in. Notice it's telling me what the format is, that these are mostly character fields. I have a fiscal year, which is a numeric field, and it's telling me that it has 4 numbers to it and no decimal places. I also have a posted total amount, which is a signed number field, and it's showing that it's a very large field. And it even gives me the option of, or I should say it's defined with 3 decimal point places. Although most of the time we only make use of 2 of them, but it does have 3. It gives me header text, ledger account, department, fund, program, very explanatory. Sometimes these are not as explanatory, and we can change this header text. So this is my output. It's going to be displayed here from top to bottom, but then these would be in my results displayed from left to right. So the topmost one would be on the left side of your report, the bottommost would be on the right side of my report in columns. And we'll see that once we look at the results of this query. Now, being as I am only going to be wanting to look at a little bit of this data, keep in mind that all these transaction tables, whether it's ledger, journal, requisitions, purchase orders, vouchers, they all have thousands of rows of data. So we're going to want to filter this down to just what I want to uniquely look at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what can I put in here to make this unique. And the way I'm going to do that is that I'm going to throw in some criteria. Now there's 2 ways of putting in criteria. One is from the Fields tab where I'm at now, and the other is on the Query tab. Now here's the question. Why would I use one tab over the other to add criteria? Why don't I just go to the Criteria tab and add the criteria? Well, if I add criteria here, and I'm just going to show this to you, you notice there nothing here is filled out on this criteria properties. I would have to search for everything here, and that just takes a little bit more work than I really want to do. So instead of doing that, I'm going to go over to my Query tab and first add criteria that I don't really want to see on the report, but I know is useful criteria for my report. So one of the most useful things, and we should always add this to our queries, is put what business unit is being used. In Ledger, we're only going to see one business unit, UCF 01. However, in accounts payable tables, like voucher, we're going to see more because accounts payable has to keep track of more than one business unit. It has to keep track of the payroll. It has to keep track of student refunds, and then of various other types of business unit data, DSO, possibly research foundation business units. So it's very important, depending on the data that you're looking at, to include the business unit in your criteria. I don't want to show it because guess what? If I pick a business unit, every row is going to show that business unit, and I don't really need to show that. So I'll click on the cone, and the cone is my criteria icon, and I'm going to type in UCF 01. And actually I keyed in UCF 01. Notice that I was very careful to change it to uppercase. Whenever you are doing a criteria, it's going to make an exact match if this condition type of equal to is used. So let's just go over really briefly what these various things are on this short page. So I first have an expression 1, then I have a condition type, and then I have expression 2. It's like in simple arithmetic where you have expressions and you're looking at what is comparative. Or maybe you're at a grocery store and you're saying, do I want to buy this mustard or this mustard? So you're comparing, and that's what a condition type is. I'm looking at business unit, which I selected from the query tab. And now my condition type automatically is equal to, and I have my constant here, which is UCF01. If I would have put in UCF01, I would not have gotten an exact match because I know that the business unit is always going to be UCF01 or one of the other business units. I need to make sure that's an exact match. Now, there are many other types of conditions which are outlined in the manual. We'll look at a few of them here. There's a between condition type. There's greater than. There's exists. There is in tree. And what I would suggest to you is look at that list of condition types that are in the query manual. Get a familiarity with them. Look at queries that you already run and see what condition types are used in those queries. And then there's also not. The thing about not condition types is it's a negative. So for example, if I said business unit not UCF01, let me get back to not equal to UCF01, it would give me all the data in all the other business units. That would not be an acceptable result. So it's always better to kind of go on the positive and use one of the ones where there is going to be a positive result with between or enlist or some of these other ones. Notice also that I have this wonderful item, and we'll try this out later, called an enlist. That means I can give a list of items that I want to compare. I also have this wonderful piece of condition type here called a like. And like means that I can use my wildcards and not have to be as exact in what I'm putting in my expression 2 field. So many different condition types to choose from. We'll stick with equal to for this example. And with equal to, I'm going to use UCF01 as my expression 2. Now constant is the default that Query Manager gives you, so you can just type in what you need there. If your expression is going to be changing anytime you run the query, like it does with when you have a condition type of date equals something, you may not want to use a constant, you may want to use a prompt. Or if you have a certain type of expression, you might want to use an expression instead. So as I am looking over here at expression 2, I notice that I can compare business unit to another field. I can compare it to an expression. I can compare it to a constant. I can compare it to a prompt. And then also subquery. And subquery is something you'll see in your queries that others have written, but you won't be using that necessarily as a first-time query user. So let's go back to constant again, which is where we started. I have my UCF01 in here, and I can just click OK. Now that I've added my business unit, it's not going to show up in fields because I didn't select it here. I don't want to show it, right? So if I go to fields, I don't see business unit. But if I go to criteria, I should see my piece of criteria. And here it is. It's always important after you add criteria to double check that you've done it correctly. Come over to the criteria tab, which is a great place to review all your criteria, and remove it if it's not correct by clicking on the delete or the minus sign. But review it and make sure that you put in the expression you wanted, that it's equal to what you want in expression 2. Because sometimes it's easy, especially on this query tab when you're selecting, to select the wrong one. Let me just show you what I mean. Notice that as I'm going way down here, that it's hard to tell which one I am pointing to. So if I, for example, wanted to pick up one of these other items here, or maybe I was trying to get an accounting period, and I accidentally clicked on a different thing. Oh, statistics code. That's not what I wanted. Or maybe I even didn't realize I had done that and put a constant in here. So I go over to my criteria tab to review what I did. Oh, I didn't mean this one. So then I will just get rid of it. So now that I have this particular piece of criteria, I still don't want to run my query because I know my ledger table is a very big table. I want to make sure that I am paring it down to just specifics. So what other criteria can I add? Most criteria that I can add, I'll find in the Fields tab, since this is the data I'm looking at. And I'm picking criteria from here because I'm both displaying it and want to use it as criteria. So one of the things I might want to use is a fiscal year. So I'm going to put this year's fiscal year. And that's good criteria too, but as once again, I have many, many pieces of data that I could use. So let me pare it down even more by just looking at a certain expense account. That's pretty narrow. So let me just look at my criteria and make sure that it's all looking as I'm expecting. Business unit, fiscal year is 2020, and now my account is 727,199. So I'm going to go ahead and save this query with just these pieces of criteria, and then we'll run it. Click on Save, and I need to come up with a query name. I'm going to call it Ledger MM and using my initials at the end of the query. Often it is a great idea when you're creating private queries to put your initials at the end of the query name so that you can identify it as your own query. This is especially true if you're copying a public query and tweaking it. You do not want to give your private query the same name as a public query. What you want to do is give it a unique name, and a lot of times just adding your initials is a way to make it unique. I also want to give my query a description. So I'm going to call it Ledger Query or Class. Notice the folder is blank. I don't need to do anything here. We'll talk about organizing queries later. It automatically defaults to being a user query and to a private query because all the queries that we'll create as query users will be private queries. If a query needs to be made public, that will be something that you want to contact the FSS service desk and tell them, I've got a really good query and it could be made as a public query for others to use who do the same job. But ordinarily, your own private query will be private, and that's how it will save for you. It won't really give you an option right here. You'll just have to save it that way. Also, you have this option of query definition. What I like about query definition, it's is a place where I can track my changes to my query. So for example, I could put more information here. If this were a temporary query, I could put temporary. I could put for fiscal year end. I could put something like for class. And then anytime I come in this query to change it, I can add my changes underneath it. Say I add a new piece of a criteria, or I have a request from a manager that says that they want the query to work a certain way. Well, I can record those changes in here. That way later when I come back to my query, I can determine why, I made that change. So it's a good way of tracking within this query definition. So now instead of saying new unsaved query, it says the name that I've given it, and it gives my description here. So I'll always know what it is. And when I search for it after I've created it, I'll be able to find it. So let's run it and see what happens. The Run tab is very useful for seeing your results and for tweaking your query in case you're getting more or less than what you thought you would get when you ran the query. So we'll run it. And I'm getting 66 rows in here, which to me is perfectly fine amount of rows. It's giving me all these various departments that have money in them for this particular expense account. And so that's a very useful type of query. It's telling me it's mostly in actuals, and maybe that's another thing I want to do is add ledger actuals, because most of the time I'm going to be doing it out of the actuals ledger. So let me go to fields again and add ledger to tweak my query a little bit more and put in the word actuals. And notice I'm very careful to do it in uppercase. That doesn't mean all your criteria will have to be in uppercase, but I know, even just from looking at my results, that this particular piece of criteria has to be in uppercase. So I'll say OK. I will save it. I'll run it again. And now I'm just getting actuals. So the Run tab is very useful. If I had prompts or other types of criteria in here, I could try different prompts and rerun my query. I can also download it to Excel. I don't generally use download to XML. It's not a useful thing to us. Also, you notice there's a view all. Sometimes it's going to be a lot more records than just 64, and you might want to view all your results on your page there before you download to Excel. Make sure that what you have is what you expect. So I'm going to go back here to criteria, and I'm very happy with what I have here. And so I'm done, really. Now I can save it again because I did add this extra piece of criteria. I want to make sure everything is saved. And it went really fast, so I probably had already saved it. But it's okay to be a little bit overdo the saving part of your queries. And what you always want to do with a query, and I'd like to make sure that you understand these various steps. They're in the book, but let's just have a quick review of the steps. Because queries work in almost like a cyclical function as far as creating them. You always start out with adding records, selecting fields, adding criteria either from the Query tab or the Fields tab using the cone, reviewing your criteria, and then you save it and run it. So those steps are very important. I'm going to go through them one more time, and we'll talk about them in other parts of this course. You're going to add records. You're going to select fields. You're going to add criteria, either from here or from the Query tab. You're going to review your criteria to make sure it's correct. You're going to save it and run it. Later on, when we go over joins, I'll be adding another record. I'll be selecting fields. from the next record that I add, I'll be adding criteria, more criteria. I'll review that criteria. I'll save it, and I'll run it. Now you notice that when I was building this basic query that there's some tabs that I didn't bother using. One of them was the expressions tab. That's very seldom used in beginning queries. When you're first learning query, that's something you won't use very often. The other one that I don't use is prompts. And that's because prompts is a good place to look at what prompts you've created. And we haven't done any for this because I didn't need to. I used constants. But we'll talk about prompts in a few minutes and add some prompts to these queries. The other tab that I didn't use was the having tab. And having is a special type of criteria that when you're doing criteria that involves an aggregate field, and an aggregate field is a summed field or a field where you're counting, then you have to have a special type of criteria called having criteria. So a lot of times you'll see this one as just a blank short page, and then you can use that as your page to save on if it's a quicker way for you to do that. But you can save pretty much on any particular tab. You'll see those same save buttons at the bottom. I'll pop through here. But notice if I save down here, I've got to go all the way down to the bottom. I kind of like to not have to scroll so much. You can save here on prompts tab too. So there's a lot of ones that you could actually do the bottom functions on, but having comes up a lot because it's always the shortest one on the tab list here. The other one that we haven't talked about yet is the View SQL. And View SQL is basically just a read-only page. And what it tells me is from all these things that I've done already, selecting records, selecting fields, maybe doing different things with fields, and adding criteria, I can see what is generated by the system to run this query. Because basically what Query Manager does for you is it gives you a simple way of creating this SQL without having to know structured query language, which is what SQL stands for. So notice that I have some elements here that tell me what I've just done. Select is the element that tells me what fields I have chosen for my query. The from statement tells me that I've picked them from Ledger. It's telling me it's a PeopleSoft table because it's got PS in front of it, and that the alias that was assigned to Ledger was the letter A. So let's just look at those two items first. Notice that it's telling me Ledger A and that every field has an A in front of it. We talked about this a little bit when we went over the query tabs, but I want to just remind you of that. So here on my query tab, Ledger is identified as the A table because it's the first one that I added to this query. So then when I go over to the Fields tab, every field is identified with the letter A. So let's go back to SQL again. And so that is why I'm seeing this statement written out as it is. It's telling me here's the A table and this is the select. If it didn't use an alias on this, then you'd have to see ledger.account, ledger.department ID, ledger fund code. So it's a lot more readable because they've assigned this little shorthand name for it in the way of using an alphabetic character. The next thing I see after I've looked at the table and I've looked at the fields is the where, what we call a where clause. And basically what where is it's giving me all my criteria here. Sometimes you'll see another item at the bottom here and it says order by, and that's when we have a sort order on our query for the results. If you wanted to sort this in a particular method, let's look at our Run tab. And we notice that we've got these departments are like all over the place. They're not grouped together. I could sort this for output by the department number. And maybe I would want to sort it next by fund. Or maybe the opposite, sort by fund and then department. So let's do that. To do a sort, which is different than moving the columns around, I still am going to return to the Fields tab. And I'm going to click on the Reorder and Sort. If you recall, we would use this left-hand column to get the order correct. We talked about that, or if we haven't talked about that, we will talk about getting the order changed. On the right-hand side, this is where we're talking about sort order of the rows. So if I wanted to sort it by fund and then department, I would say, okay, this is the first thing I want to sort by, so I put a 1 next to fund. And then department ID, I want to sort second and 2. If I wanted to sort it with the last thing first, which I might want to do if it was a date field, then I would click on this descending box as well. But we just want to sort it from the first to last. And so we are going to just select those two. So here they appear in the order column. We talked about this a little bit when we reviewed the tabs. I'm going to say save, and I'm going to run it. And now all my E&G funds come up first, followed by other funds, and then it's in department order. And so that makes it a little bit readable. Now, why would you bother with a sort in your query? You can do that in Excel. And that is true, but if you're doing it every time, you're going to want to have it in your query so you don't have to, every time you run the Excel report, resort the data. So let me look at my View SQL tab now that I've made this change. And notice it says order by 4 and 3. That's my sort. Now, why does it say 4 and 3? Let's go back to my Fields tab. Fund is the 4th field, and department is the 3rd. So that's why it's saying that this order is by fund code, the 4th field, and department ID, the 3rd field. So actually, you've gotten to learn a little bit of SQL today just by building a simple query and then adding these particular, looking at these particular items and understanding what these various types of statements mean. So that's a simple query, and those are the steps.